Girls are always coming home with my roommate. I've just never seen any of them leave. I met my roommate online when he answered my ad looking for someone to take my friend Allison's recently vacated room in our 2-bedroom apartment. And while I initially had some concerns about living with a guy, what with me being a girl and all, we ended up being the perfect roommates, for at least a little while. I kept to myself in my room, reading, binging content, snuggling with my cat, and going to bed at an unhealthily early hour, while he did the opposite, spending most of his time outside, partying, always returning home in the wee hours of the night, often with a lady friend. And despite his sometimes weekly one-night stands, which I did my best to drown out, he didn't bother me. After all, he could have been so much worse, caused drama, left dirty dishes in the sink, done drugs openly, thrown parties at our apartment, but he never did any of that. He just liked to bring home strangers. It was his thing, and who was I to judge him for having a little fun? So I continued to ignore his one-night stands, throwing on my headphones, or blasting ambient rain sounds every time I'd hear him and his guest of the week having sex for hours on end. And for a little while, all was well, until one day, when I heard him leave his room by himself, and I realized that, after months of living together, I had never once heard or seen a single one of the women he brought home leave the apartment. Now, normally one could chalk that up to me leaving for work early and just not being there when they left. But the thing is, I work from home. I'm there all day, every day. So after having that realization, I began to grow suspicious. And from that point forward, every time he'd bring a girl home, I'd make it a point to wake up early the next morning and listen carefully all day for any sign of her leaving. But time and time again, whenever he'd bring a woman home, I'd never hear or see her leave. Eventually, I worked up the courage to ask my roommate about it. Hey, did that girl from last night ever leave? Yeah. That's funny, I didn't hear her. Oh, she left in the morning. I was up in the morning and didn't hear anything. Oh, right. Maybe it was in the middle of the night. I don't remember. His answers were dismissive and suspicious, to say the least. I thought about calling the police, but realized I had no proof that any of these women were actually disappearing, or that any foul play was really going on. So I did what any right-minded roommate would do, and rather than call the cops, I decided to investigate myself. So one day after my roommate left the house, I installed a tiny surveillance camera that I'd ordered online, in the hallway, aiming it at his bedroom door. Sure enough, the next time he brought a girl home and I reviewed the footage, she never left his room the next day. So I confronted my roommate again. Weird, I didn't hear the girl from last night leave? No, well, she definitely left. I didn't hear anyone in the hallway. Oh, she went out through the fire escape. The fire escape? Don't ask me, she gets off on sneaking out. Right, I replied, not buying his excuse. So I did the next thing any right-minded roommate would do, and ordered another tiny surveillance camera, this time aiming it at the fire escape. And sure enough, the next time he brought a girl home and I reviewed the footage from both cameras, neither one captured the girl exiting his room. Left with no clues, I decided to forget about the mystery altogether, once again donning a pair of headphones or turning up my speaker whenever my roommate would have someone over. Until one night when I just so happened to fall asleep without any music and heard screaming coming from his room. And not like sex screaming, like someone getting killed screaming. Knock, knock, knock. My roommate opened the door, shirtless and annoyed. What's up? Everything okay in there? I heard screaming. That's embarrassing. We were just, I'll tell her to keep it down. I tried to peek in to see if the girl was all right, but before I could look over his shoulder, he had already shut the door. And once again, I never heard her leave the next day. So later that week, I waited for my roommate to leave the house and snuck into his room, only to find nothing. Just a messy bedroom and an unmade bed. It just didn't make sense. If the girls he was bringing home weren't leaving his apartment, where did they go? But ultimately, I resolved to give up my investigation again, reasoning that I must have been overlooking something obvious that could explain it all away. Until one night when my roommate came home pissed drunk by himself while I was in the kitchen, and I seized the opportunity to have a conversation with him. We talked for a while before he offered up something very strange. I'm a bad man. I'm sorry. You hear what goes on. What goes on? I'm not following you. I'm not a good person. Oh, come on. Yeah, you are. No, I'm really not. I have a problem. A problem like a sex addiction? No, something else. What else? Well, if I told you, I'd have to kill you. I laughed nervously, waiting for him to crack a smile, but he never did. Instead, he removed a knife from the kitchen cabinet and placed it against my neck. I swear, if you keep asking about the girls I bring home, I'll kill you too. My heart stopped. My palms started sweating, and I grew short of breath as I waited to see what he'd do next. But he simply turned around, walked to his bedroom, and closed the door behind him. I could barely sleep that night, and the next morning, I packed my bags and moved out. I know in that moment I should have called the police, or told someone, anyone, but for whatever reason, maybe trauma or fear, I didn't. I simply found a new place, in another borough of the city, and tried to start anew. But no matter how hard I tried to forget what I'd experienced in that apartment, I couldn't help but wonder, where did all those girls go? What had he done to them? And most importantly, what had he done with them? Still obsessed with the mystery, I sometimes even found myself watching through the footage from the 2 security cameras I had installed in the apartment, hoping that I'd see a girl leave his room, or crawl out of his window and down the fire escape. But once again, I came up empty-handed and, emotionally exhausted, decided I had no other choice but to block it all away. Weeks became months, months became years, and I finally found myself forgetting about what I'd heard in the apartment, until last week, when I matched with my old roommate on a dating app. I'm not exactly sure how it happened. I must have just swiped on him accidentally, but all I know is he left me a message. "Hey, been a while. Miss having you around the apartment. To be honest, I had a crush on you back then. Let me know if you'd want to come back over sometime." My hands began to shake as I read the message and considered my options. Finally, after all these years, report him to the police, unmatch him, or visit him and find out once and for all what's really going on over there. And no matter how hard I tried to resist the last option, I felt compelled to return to my old apartment, and the next day found myself standing in his bedroom as he closed the door behind us. We spent the first hour or two watching a movie, during which time it became very obvious, as I had expected, that he intended to sleep with me. But when I made it clear that I had no interest in sex, he got frustrated and moved his agenda along. "Want to see the roof?" The roof? In all my years living in the apartment, I had always been under the impression that no one in the building had access to it. Apparently, I was wrong. He then proceeded to open his closet door and revealed a ladder to the roof. "Yeah, I want to show you something." "Okay, sure," I replied, somehow at the same time playing along as if I didn't know his intentions, realizing that the roof must be where all the bodies of those girls are, and terrified by what was about to happen. But I had to find out. A few minutes later, I climbed up the ladder and onto the roof to find nothing, yet again. Just an empty rooftop. It just didn't make sense. I was sure that the girls would be up there. I looked out at the skyline of the city, unable to not compare its striking beauty with the horror that was sure to unfold. "Beautiful view. Oh, that's not what I wanted you to see," he replied as he walked over to the side of the building and gestured for me to follow. "Take a look." There, between my old apartment building and the neighboring one, was a square fence, separating us from the space between the buildings. I walked over to the edge and looked down, careful to keep an eye on him in my peripherals, and sure enough, saw it. The very answer to the mystery. A hollow brick shaft with no windows that went straight to the ground 4 stories below. And at the bottom were the countless bodies of the women that my roommate had brought home, stacked on top of each other. Each one clearly brought up to the roof just as I had, and each one clearly pushed off the roof and down to the bottom. I turned to my old roommate, a look of horror washing over my face as he charged at me and tried to push me down. We grappled for what felt like minutes, as I teetered on falling off the edge, struggling to grip onto the edge of the building. But what he didn't know was that I had come prepared. Suddenly, blood started spraying out of his body as I removed the very steak knife he had once threatened me with. He gave me a look of surprise, as if he had never in his wildest dreams expected that one of the women he brought up to the roof would ever be capable of putting up a fight, let alone putting an end to it all. He was wrong. I simply looked on as he clenched his wounds and took a few steps back, tumbling down the shaft between the buildings and landing at the bottom, his body splattering beside the mound of his victims. I stood there, frozen and shaking, terrified by what I had encountered, but at the same time, relieved to have discovered where all those women had gone. I called the police immediately. But the thing about my roommate was, it turned out he was the son of a very rich politician. And the thing about the sons of very rich politicians is, no matter how much evidence there is against them, sometimes their crimes can just disappear. So when the police recovered the bodies, it was no surprise that no mention of what had happened was ever reported or published in the news. So here I am, the sole survivor of my roommate's killing spree, and the only one with any knowledge of what happened to all those women, left with only my memory, my words, and the hope that someone will believe me.